When was World War I lost? For Germany. Some historians maintain that the war was effectively decided as early as 1914, when Germany failed to achieve a quick victory over France and was instead forced into a prolonged two-front war, the nightmarish situation it had tried to avoid. Other historians point to the so-called Kaiser's Battle, the German offensive launched in the spring of 1918. By this stage, Germany's strategic position was rapidly deteriorating, and with the Americans beginning to tip the balance in favor of the Entente, time itself had become an enemy. The Kaiser's Battle was thus a desperate gamble. German forces launched a series of massive attacks, overstretching their supply lines and exhausting Germany's remaining reserves of trained soldiers. When the offensive stalled and the Entente struck back, Germany's fate was definitively sealed. It could also be argued that the war's outcome had already been decided a year earlier. By early 1917, the Germans still held the initiative. The American historian David M. Kennedy describes the Entente situation at the time as rather grim.
The French, exhausted and demoralized, could only wait for relief from another quarter. Across the Channel in London, British Prime Minister David Lloyd George also waited. When he had heard on February 4, 1917, of Wilson's response to the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign, Lloyd George had exploded. And so he is not going to fight after all. He is awaiting another insult before he actually draws the sword.
The another quarter referred to here was, obviously, the United States. The Americans were expected to enter the war on the side of the Allies, who were growing ever more desperate and exhausted. And enter they did. On the 6th of April, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson at last addressed Congress, declaring war upon Germany and altering the course of history. But amid the contest for world dominance by the great powers, something else was quietly taking shape in the background. 3 days after Wilson's speech, a train set out from Switzerland. In one of its carriages sat a man who, outside a few intellectual circles and certain intelligence services, was still largely unknown in Europe. Back then, Vladimir Lenin was living in poverty and had a relatively small revolutionary party. He was a short, bald man with small dark eyes, usually wearing a brimmed hat, much too large for his head. Despite his fantasies of violent revolution, he himself tended to avoid physical confrontation, even abandoning his friends when a brawl was about to break out. Not long before, he still believed he would not live to see the workers overthrow the Tsar. Now, however, word has reached him. Russia is in revolution. After more than a decade spent in political exile in Europe, Lenin can at last return home. It's a massive risk though. The transit has been arranged by the Germans. Lenin is effectively collaborating with the German High Command, something which, if it ever came to light, could make him seem a foreign agent and compromise him in the eyes of his enemies in Russia, on both the political right and the left. Nevertheless, he takes the gamble. Even a bargain with the devil will do, Lenin says, if it means he can return to Russia. Politically, he is a warrior, certain of his ideas, and with a gift for leadership at once ruthless and inspiring. Still, it would be a mistake to assume that Vladimir Lenin rose from an impoverished political outcast to the head of a country of 135 million people solely on the strength of his talent and revolutionary will. The train and safe passage were arranged by the German High Command, but it wasn't Lenin who persuaded the Germans to follow through. There was a third party, a man known as Helphand, working quietly behind the scenes, who convinced the German Foreign Ministry that introducing a force such as Lenin into the equation would destabilize Russia. That prospect appealed to Berlin, since Russia was at war with Germany at the time. Helphand financed Lenin's Bolsheviks without even consulting Lenin, and by the summer of 1917, he was their only backer from outside Russia. Without him, the October Revolution, also known as the Bolshevik Revolution, might never have happened. And it wasn't just Russia. Helphand's fingerprints are all over the Ottoman Empire's collapse as well. He looked like a tightly stuffed sack, as one Estonian Bolshevik described him. Grossly fat, prematurely bald, short-legged, but with intelligent eyes. The infamous Rosa Luxemburg would refer to him as the fatty.
Am I merely morally degenerate, or without any morals whatsoever? I do not know. Such has been my life. Such I was, and such I am. "Judge me as you will, I know no other way,"
he wrote in 1919 in Die Glock, attempting to defend himself against scandalous accusations involving indecent gatherings at his house and his relationships with significantly younger women. Helphand's children were scattered across Europe, and he cared little for them. He married young, a Russian midwife, then left her for another woman who bore his son in a Tsarist prison. He later left her as well, with little thought for the consequences. He had no appetite for a regular life with a happy wife and a steady income. His ambitions ran elsewhere. Helphand held traditional family and morals in contempt, dismissing them as merely bourgeois. Konrad Heinisch, a German Marxist, wrote in Helphand's defense,
"He is a true son of Russia, of a European country of, also spiritually, unlimited possibilities, and in his veins there doubtless flows a remarkable mixture of Jewish, Russian, and Tatar blood. Such a man has the right to be judged according to the laws of his own nature. One should not hurriedly measure him by current standards, which in Germany have become a part of our flesh and blood, or apply to him our own attitudes, however much proved they may be."
Although he had begun as a Russian revolutionary, Helphand scarcely resembled one on the outside. He was immensely wealthy, loved big cars, thick cigars, beautiful blonde girls by his side, and champagne for breakfast, displaying the worst of bourgeois vulgarity and a brilliant Marxist mind, as Michael Pearson writes in The Sealed Train, a book I highly recommend. The man went by several names: Israel Lazarovich Helphand, Alexander, Parvus. If you wrote Parvus's life as fiction, some people would say you'd overdone it. From sitting in a dark, cold cell in the Peter and Paul fortress alongside other Russian revolutionaries, to rubbing shoulders with the Young Turks in Constantinople and making a fortune as a businessman. In this video, we'll cover it all, so sit back and enjoy. Israel Lazarovich Helphand, who later took the name Alexander and wrote under the pseudonym Parvus, was born in 1867 to a lower middle-class Jewish family in Berezino, a small town that now lies in Belarus. At the time, it sat within the Russian Empire's Pale of Settlement, the region where Jews were permitted to live, but under a web of restrictions that barred them from many professions and public offices. As a result, many families earned their living as tradesmen and craftsmen, supporting one another and seldom hiring non-Jews. The Jews, in turn, were rarely hired by Gentiles. Living in the same lands as Russians, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, and Poles, Jews nonetheless lived isolated, separate, both physically and spiritually. They had a world of their own, with its own concerns and moral dilemmas. As the historians Zbigniew Zeman and Winfried Scharlau write,
"They lived in the past, on their historical memories. The exodus from Egypt, Abraham's sacrifice, the occupation of Canaan. These events were alive for them, and hotly disputed."
While Parvus was still a child, his family moved to Odessa, Ukraine. In the 1870s, Odessa was a flourishing Black Sea port and one of the Russian Empire's great trading centers. Then, in 1881, when Parvus was already a teenager, Tsar Alexander II was assassinated. Jews were blamed, and the ensuing pogroms reached Odessa. It is likely that experiencing anti-Semitic violence in Odessa hardened the young Parvus against the Tsar, and may well have been the impetus for his turn towards revolutionary activity, although that is speculative. According to Parvus himself, he first learned about class struggle through the writings of the Ukrainian national poet Taras Shevchenko, and was inspired by accounts of Ukrainian peasant and Cossack rebellions against Polish domination in the 18th century. In 1886, at 19, Parvus traveled abroad for the first time in search of revolutionary literature, which was not available in the Russian Empire, not to mention the fact that many Russian revolutionary leaders were now living in the West anyway. He went to Zurich, Switzerland, and read all he could get his hands on there. Europe changed Parvus. He would soon discard his Russian Jewish identity, as well as his exclusively Russian revolutionary interests, and become absorbed by political and economic developments further west. Like Karl Marx, he was not content merely to describe and understand the world. He wanted to change it. He possessed a writer's temperament, yet his mind ran to politics. After earning his doctorate in Switzerland, he moved to Germany, though not for Germany itself, but for the German Social Democratic Party, convinced that the fate of world revolution would be decided in Berlin. To Parvus, the class struggle in Germany mattered far more than the fight against Tsarism in Russia. He had no desire to naturalize as a German in any cultural sense, and felt no sympathy for the conservative side of his new country. By this point, Parvus presented himself simply as a member of the working class, the proletariat. Still, although he no longer saw himself as a Russian revolutionary, his first major success as a socialist writer came from his commentary on the Russian famine of 1891, also known as the Tsar famine. Parvus used it as evidence to support a revolutionary critique of the entire system, rather than dismissing it as an accident or the failure of a particular policy. His reasoning was not so different from that of other Marxist thinkers, but Parvus went a step further. Friedrich Engels believed that Russia's degeneration would mean security for Europe. Parvus, however, saw the troubled period Russia was passing through as only a temporary setback. He argued that within 10 to 15 years, the country would flourish in a capitalist sense and, together with America, would push Europe out of its economic hegemony. In 1893, Parvus's Marxist writings drew the attention of the Prussian police. He was ordered to leave Berlin, which he did. Expelled from the capital, Parvus, now his mid-20s, grew increasingly estranged from the German Social Democratic Party, geographically and ideologically. Parvus was obsessed with the idea of revolution, whereas his German colleagues gravitated towards smaller, gradual reforms. Parvus could not escape his roots. In his heart, he was a Russian intellectual, not a German one. Parvus's radicalism was welcomed in Munich by the younger Russian socialists, Lenin among them. As his influence waned in German circles, it grew among Russian Marxists. His flat in Munich became a focal point for revolutionaries. It was there that Rosa Luxemburg met Lenin for the first time. Over the next 5 years among the Russian exiles, Parvus amassed considerable political influence in Russia. There was even a small group of activists in St. Petersburg known as the Parvusists. They favored Parvus's position of aligning with neither the militant Bolsheviks nor the more moderate and democratic Mensheviks. In 1904, Tsarist Russia blundered into a destructive war with Japan. Parvus was convinced that this would inevitably lead to revolution.
The Russo-Japanese War is the blood-red dawn of coming great events,
he wrote. This proved prophetic. The disastrous, casualty-heavy, and avoidable war with Japan ultimately led to Bloody Sunday. In January 1905, Russian soldiers in St. Petersburg fired on peaceful protesters. Throughout the spring and summer of that year, Parvus remained in Europe, but the situation in Russia continued to deteriorate. In October 1905, a massive workers' strike erupted. Parvus judged that the revolution had entered a decisive phase and decided to return to Russia. Parvus was beside himself with excitement. The revolution felt within his grasp at last. He was now in his late 30s, approaching 40, not a young man anymore, but still young enough to believe he might live to witness the overthrow of the Tsar and play a part in it. Together with Trotsky, he organized strikes as a weapon for seizing political power, and they did so without holding back. The Mensheviks and even the Bolsheviks feared that the constantly rising tension might alienate the middle class and turn it against the workers, and so they urged moderation. Parvus and Trotsky ignored them. They were convinced the revolution had no need of tactful cooperation with the bourgeoisie, and that what was required now was a rapid advance. More than that, they believed the socialist revolution would soon spill from Russia into Western Europe in a kind of domino effect. They were both greatly mistaken. Western Europe was not ripe for revolution, and neither was Russia. By December 1905, it was clear that the Tsar and the middle classes would not give way so easily. Parvus took one last drastic measure, a manifesto urging the people of Russia to withdraw their bank deposits and demand payment in gold, in the hope of bringing the Tsarist government down financially. But the government quickly confiscated the manifesto and moved in to arrest the revolutionaries. Parvus escaped at first and worked underground for a time, before being caught in April 1906 and ending up in a cold, dark cell in the Peter and Paul fortress. For Trotsky, solitary confinement wasn't an issue. In fact, when the time came to leave his cell, crammed with manuscripts and books, he did so almost regretfully, having grown accustomed to the quiet, uneventful life in prison, which was perfect for concentration and intellectual work. Parvus, however, was not the sort of man who could enjoy his own company. He sank into self-pity, paced back and forth in the damp cell, full of regret and bitterness, longing for his freedom, his comforts, and the adventurous life he had led in Europe. A few months later, his sentence arrived: 3 years in Siberia. Jail or banishment was an integral part of a Russian Marxist's life, almost a kind of holiday. The prisons were hardly pleasant, but they were still a far cry from the later industrial-scale system of prisons and camps built by the totalitarian Russian state. Lenin himself spent 3 years in Siberia. But Parvus was no Lenin. He had no intention of prolonging his captivity. Hidden in small bundles of linen, he had diamonds to bribe the guards, the addresses of local party agents who could help him, as well as cash and forged passports for his escape. Already far in the north, after passing the town of Yeniseisk, he plied the guards with drinks, then slipped away and boarded a third-class train to Krasnoyarsk, among the peasants. The stench and dirt of the carriage Parvus did not enjoy. He returned to St. Petersburg far more comfortably in second class and took a room in a hotel, perhaps believing his forged passport would conceal him well enough. It did not, and only thanks to a warning from a comrade did he evade the police. Parvus fled St. Petersburg for Europe without even stopping to collect his luggage. Back in Germany, Parvus reunited with Trotsky, who had also escaped exile while en route to Siberia. The reunion, though hopeful at first, lacked warmth. Trotsky was older now, more independent. Before long, they went their separate ways, as Trotsky left for Vienna. Parvus enjoyed some early success as a writer, but he turned down invitations to join the Russian exile press. He had had enough of Russia. Moreover, Germany was growing increasingly hostile to Russian Marxist exiles. Keen to maintain good relations with Russia, and to demonstrate it, German authorities came down hard on the Tsar's main enemies, the Russian revolutionaries. Neither Germany nor Russia offered the ambitious Parvus the opportunities he wanted. Fortunately for him, in the southeast another empire was in decline and ready to rupture. In 1910, Parvus packed his bags and left for Constantinople. Parvus's move to Constantinople in late 1910, initially meant to be a brief stay, became a decisive turning point in his life. Living in Turkey for nearly 5 years, he experienced real poverty, moving among the city's poorest inhabitants and struggling to maintain even the appearance of European respectability.
Often I had to tread carefully, so that nobody could see the holes in my shoes,
he once told his friend, reminiscing about his years in Constantinople. Yet it was in Constantinople that he laid the foundations of his later wealth, finding opportunities that were simply not available to him in Germany. Exactly how Parvus made his fortune, historians can only speculate. Commercial dealings in the capital of the Ottoman Empire were fluid, informal, and rarely documented, leaving little trace. What we do know is that the wealthy Turks of the capital held business in contempt and left it to Armenians, Greeks, and Jews. Parvus, himself a Jew who spoke several languages, may well have found opportunity in this opaque, heterogeneous commercial world, acting as advisor, broker, and trader. By 1912, he was already operating successfully on a significant scale. At the same time, he cultivated connections with local politicians, becoming economic editor of the Young Turks newspaper, Turk Yurdu, sharing intelligence about the Balkans with the Turkish government, and perhaps even helping to arrange the supply of weapons to the Turkish army during the Balkan Wars. In Constantinople, Parvus learned that political power could be acquired with money, and that money could be acquired with political power. In 1914, shots rang out in Sarajevo. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was dead. Parvus, still in Constantinople, watched the First World War with a certain indifference. He had no desire to return to his comrades up north, not because he had betrayed socialism, but because the old way of doing things no longer appealed. Traveling with your pockets stuffed with explosives and illegal Marxist literature, only to end the journey in prison or banishment to Siberia. That was, so to speak, the Russian revolutionaries' bread and butter, and Parvus had tired of it, and he had no further need of it. By then, he was wealthy, and he had acquired a measure of political capital. Parvus in 1914 could at last begin to act on his own terms. He urged Ottoman officials to mobilize their forces and throw in their lot with Germany, assuring the Turks that Germany would win. He was a major factor in Turkey's early entry into the war, and, in time, one of the reasons the Ottoman Empire collapsed. That's not to say that the destruction of the Ottoman Empire had been his plan from the outset. It seems, rather, that he genuinely believed an alliance between the Central Powers and Russia's revolutionaries would bring down the Tsar. In his own words, in 1915, to the German ambassador in Constantinople, "The interests of the German government are identical with those of the Russian revolutionaries." These activities earned Parvus both notoriety and suspicion. Socialists accused him of being a German agent and a corrupt businessman. But Parvus kept working. He developed a plan to destroy Tsarist Russia, break it from the inside while attacking it militarily from the outside. He would serve as the middleman for financing a Ukrainian national uprising, convinced that if Ukraine broke away, the centralized Tsarist state would collapse. An anti-Tsarist uprising in Finland was also part of Parvus's plan. This caught the Germans' attention. They were not, of course, interested in the destruction of the Romanov dynasty, a socialist revolution, or anything of that sort. Kaiser Wilhelm and Tsar Nicholas were cousins after all, both of German descent, and in their letters they even addressed one another affectionately as Willy and Nicky. But they were at war. Backing Russian revolutionaries offered Berlin a means of putting pressure on the Tsar and hastening diplomatic negotiations. For that purpose, acting as a middleman, Parvus would soon receive 1 million marks. Operating in this way, using the levers of money, high-level contacts, and the machinery of war, was sheer delight to Parvus. He believed he was paving the way for his ultimate entrance as the savior of the revolution. Yet, history had other plans for him. After nearly 5 years out of touch with the socialists in Germany, he had lost their trust. He was branded a Russian agent, a Turkish agent, above all, a scoundrel and a trickster. When he finally returned to Berlin and went to see Rosa Luxemburg, she simply showed him the door, with no interest in hearing what her old friend had come to say. Many, Trotsky included, now detested Parvus, holding him up as an example of the socialist movement in decline. The greatest loss for Parvus was Lenin. Without Lenin, he had no access to the socialist underground and no way to operate effectively inside Russia. When the two met, Lenin did not even let him finish speaking. He denounced Parvus as a foreign agent, showed him the door, and told him never to return. Left to his own devices, Parvus had no other choice. He formed an organization of his own, headquartered in the capital of neutral Denmark, and began mediating between the German Empire and the subversive movement inside Russia. Without even being asked, Parvus promised the Germans a swift overthrow of the Tsar. But once again, he overestimated his abilities. A workers' strike did break out in St. Petersburg in January 1916, and Parvus took credit for it, but it produced no tangible results. He tried to make excuses to the Germans, yet the reality was plain enough. His promise of revolution had turned out to be a dud. State Secretary von Jagow was particularly unimpressed. A man from a noble Prussian family, he detested agents and schemers. Their methods did not sit well with his taste for order and decorum. He had disliked Parvus from the start, and now, with the scheme faltering, he felt vindicated. Disappointed, the German Foreign Ministry set Parvus aside, for the time being. But Parvus, utterly convinced revolution was still coming, refused to give up. And about a year later, it finally happened. It was spontaneous, unexpected, and a welcome surprise to the Russian exiles in Germany, Parvus included. But he was quick to collect himself and seize the opportunity. He got back in touch with his old allies in the German authorities, urging them to arrange transport for the Bolsheviks through Germany, and, crucially, to refrain from launching a major offensive. An attack, he warned, could unite Russians, revive patriotic feeling, and rally support behind the Tsar. This time, the Germans were more receptive. They believed Parvus's connections inside Russia might prove useful, perhaps even decisive. How did Parvus persuade them to back Lenin in particular, you might ask? He simply pointed out that Lenin was the only Russian party leader who was disciplined, effective, and unequivocally in favor of Russia exiting the war. As Richard von Kuhlmann, the German Foreign Secretary, put it in 1917,
"The Bolshevik movement could never have attained the scale or the influence which it has today without our continual support."
And Parvus was the main link between the two sides. On the 13th of April, Lenin arrived in Stockholm, a stop on his journey to Petrograd, the city formerly known as St. Petersburg. Parvus, who had set up his base of operations in Sweden's capital, was already waiting. The two did not meet. Instead, Parvus sent word, asking what political course Lenin meant to pursue. Lenin replied as one would expect. Diplomacy did not interest him. Revolutionary agitation did. Parvus was displeased by such indifference to politics. He had Lenin warned that unless he turned his mind to statesmanship, he would become a tool in Parvus's hands. In November 1917, the news reached Europe. There had been a coup d'etat. Lenin and the Bolsheviks had taken power. In Vienna, Parvus watched with enthusiasm. Socialist newspapers celebrated it as the revolution of peace. Parvus, though viewed with suspicion by Russian revolutionaries, had a request to return to Russia delivered personally to Lenin. Lenin, precisely because of those suspicions, refused. Without Bolshevik support, Parvus had little choice. He turned himself over to the German Foreign Ministry. He could still influence their actions, but only in a limited way. All he could do was console himself with the hope that the Bolshevik regime would soon collapse, and that revolution would sweep through Germany. Parvus felt hurt. All that scheming, years of preparation, only to be used and tossed aside. In his mind, Lenin's refusal wasn't caution, it was hostility. Where he had once urged the Germans to avoid annexing Russian territory, his tone now hardened, and his sympathies shifted. By late 1917, in Copenhagen, he was telling the German diplomat Ulrich von Brockdorff-Rantzau that if negotiations with the Bolsheviks failed, there was a simpler solution. Send 500,000 troops, defeat Russia, and carve it up until its power was broken for good. And if Germany crushed France in the West, then negotiations would be pointless. Germany could move east without restraint, smash Russia, raise a vast army on the ruins, and dictate terms to Europe. In the months that followed, Parvus began to sketch a vision of German political and military supremacy so sweeping that it is unsettling in hindsight, an outline that would later echo in the geopolitical fantasies of an Austrian veteran then still serving on the Western Front. To the German diplomats, Parvus's ideas about Russia were, as the Merchant of Revolution puts it, pure music to the ears. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk left Germany's rulers quietly satisfied with the Bolsheviks. At last, they could breathe easier. The nightmare of a two-front war was over. But relief did not mean trust. Russia still had to be kept under control, politically contained, economically penetrated, and, as far as possible, made useful. State Secretary Paul von Hinze put it with brutal clarity.
What do we want in the East? The military paralysis of Russia. The Bolsheviks are taking care of this better than any other Russian party, without our contributing a single man or a single penny. We cannot demand that they or other Russians should love us for the fact that we are squeezing their country like an orange. That is exactly what we are doing. We are not cooperating with the Bolsheviks. We are exploiting them. That is what politics is about.
For a project like that, Parvus's assistance was perfectly suited. Returning to his strategic hub in Stockholm, Parvus threw himself into an anti-Bolshevik press campaign, newspapers denouncing the Bolsheviks for their ignorance and warning that Russia was not yet ripe for socialism were shipped across the border and distributed free of charge. Russia, he argued, first had to industrialize. It was not ready for a dictatorship of the proletariat. Parvus insisted that a minority like the Bolsheviks could not terrorize the majority of the Russian nation, not even with machine guns. He called them an insult to the history of European revolutions, and sneered that the Soviets were, in his words, more of a Jewish cabal than a modern democracy. Parvus churned out propaganda against the Bolsheviks, serving German interests, yes, but also feeding a private vendetta. Yet, he was already past 50, and the years were beginning to show. He was aging quickly, and his sense of reality seemed to fray at the edges, drifting into a world where wishful thinking and fact could merge. He seemed genuinely startled by the portrait now circulating in Europe's press. Parvus the crook, Parvus the war profiteer. All his plans had foundered. His reputation was beyond repair. By now, Parvus felt himself bound to Germany. Germany's victory, he told himself, would be his victory too. But once again, Parvus was mistaken. He had left continental Europe only once, when he travelled to London for the Second Internationals Congress in 1896. To Parvus, Germany was the centre of the world. Even when the war's outcome had become obvious by late summer 1918, Parvus did not realise it until September. The prospect of German victory had taken hold of him completely. The German Empire collapsed, and with it, Parvus's world. The shock sobered him some. He began warning that the Reich's sudden turn toward democracy was not born of conviction, but of tactical concessions offered to the victorious Entente. Fearing a revolution spawned by military defeat, one he neither wanted nor believed in, Parvus stayed on the sidelines when upheaval finally started in November 1918. Publicly discredited and tainted by wartime collaboration and profiteering, he retreated from politics and went into voluntary exile in Switzerland. Parvus had come to Germany from Switzerland in 1891 as a militant, radical socialist. 27 years later, he returned, disillusioned and withdrawn, yet wealthy enough to live comfortably in Switzerland. On the way, he saw poverty everywhere, civilians with nowhere to return to, and troops coming home in rags. It was the grim face of a defeated country. Parvus wanted to escape it all, and Switzerland, he thought, offered that escape. He meant it as a one-way journey, an exile in comfort, where he would live out his remaining years. He bought a small but costly estate, complete with a chauffeur, chambermaids, a cook, and 2 Swiss farmers to work the land. By then, Parvus was truly rich, with investments spread across Europe, from Sweden to Turkey. But he could not escape his past. Europe was gripped by fear of Bolshevism, and Parvus, a former revolutionary with ties to the Bolsheviks, quickly became a figure onto which conspiracies were projected. Before long, the Swiss government served him with a deportation order, and in early 1920, he left for Berlin. Parvus remained at heart an intellectual, and though he was now rather old, his mind was still sharp enough to see the danger of treating Germany too harshly after the war. In 1921, he warned,
"If you destroy Germany, then you will make the German nation the organizer of the next world war. There exist 2 possibilities only. Either the unification of Western Europe or Russia's domination. The whole game with the buffer states will end in their annexation by Russia, unless they are united with Central Europe in an economic community, which would provide a counterbalance to Russia. Either Western Europe retains its industrial leadership, and for this purpose it has to be politically cohesive, or it will become subordinate economically, politically, and culturally to a great Russia, the frontiers of which will extend from the Pacific to the Atlantic Ocean. This would mean the fall of French as well as of German culture. In such a case, we should start to teach Russian to our children at school and introduce them to Russian history, so that they would not be helpless when they came under Russian rule."
In those years, Parvus became an advocate of something like a European Union, a cohesive economic bloc that could bind the continent together. He tried to push this idea through his new newspaper, Wiederaufbau, meaning reconstruction. But the venture collapsed in September 1923, undone by financing shortfalls and organizational troubles. This was the end of Parvus's participation in public life. What remains for an old man who has burnt through his intellect, his energy, his will. Parvus married a young Bavarian woman, an episode she would later regret, and on the 12th of December 1924 died of a heart attack in Berlin. The funeral felt less like a family or religious rite than a political ceremony. The mourners were socialists. With little taste for religious ritual, they bade him farewell as a revolutionary, someone whose work they meant to carry on. Some years after Parvus died in 1924, Nazi propaganda turned him into a convenient enemy figure. His identity as a Jew, a Marxist, and a speculator made him a perfect fit for Hitler's image of the Jude. Today, Parvus has slipped into relative obscurity, usually resurfacing only as a footnote in the stories of Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, and the others. Is it because his role was smaller, less significant? Hardly. Parvus simply wasn't and isn't a hero to anyone. Luxemburg was killed and became a socialist martyr. Trotsky stood front and center in the Bolshevik Revolution and, like Luxemburg, left behind writings that are still read. Parvus could write as well as any of them, but he left no classics. What he did leave was lots of money and the reputation of a wartime collaborator. By clearing Lenin's path to power, Parvus poisoned his own name, making it almost impossible for later socialists to give him an honorable place in their stories. His life didn't end in triumph, but it didn't end in a clean downfall either. Russia revolutionized, Lenin took the prize, empires collapsed, and Parvus was left rich, infamous, and politically disposable. The movement he'd grown up believing in moved on without him, and the world he helped reshape refused to give him a role in what came after, leaving him as one of history's most complicated figures. Not a hero, not a martyr, but a man who tried to game a revolution and learned too late that revolutions consume their instruments. If you learned something new, consider leaving a like. It helps a lot. And if you're interested in Eastern and Central European history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video.